Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar with ESG and Trend Micro. Thank you so much for joining the first webinar in a series of cloud-related webinars by Trend Micro. Before we dive into the webinar, just a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few widgets. You can use the Q&A widget to submit your questions. Our presenters will be answering the questions throughout the webinar. Also note there is a resource widget which has a copy of today's deck and the survey being discussed in the webinar. If you want to expand your screen, please click the maximize icon on the top right area of the slide. And lastly, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available by tomorrow. And with that, I'll hand it over to David.
Okay, thanks, Elham. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is David Clement. I'm the Global Product Marketing Manager for our Cloud Security team at Trend Micro, along with Doug Hayhill, ESG Vice President and Group Director of Cybersecurity at ESG. So we'll be going through a number of different topics today, and Doug will kick that off momentarily. But out of the gate, Trend Micro has been very engaged with organizations and their DevOps teams over the last several years, development communities, developer streams, and so on. And we've been able to help various organizations with their cloud migration, their security transitions across their build pipelines, their cloud platforms, and their cloud-native application designs as well. So this journey is often fast-moving. Once teams are established and they have early adoption of their security protocols, it's really key to keeping these protocols and security trajectories ongoing. The cloud projects and the customer data that they have to secure is critical to their business ventures. So as we move through this, we want to make sure that there's a stream of new technologies that we're addressing. And so we'll go over that near the end of the webinar. But Doug's going to go through the importance of really the peer interactions that we see across these surveys and how they pertain to groups like your own. In terms of how they're securing applications in their cloud migrations. So, Doug, why don't you walk us through today's agenda and then the background of your research?
Sure thing. David, thanks very much. And thanks, everybody, for joining today's webinar. I have to warn you up front, I love talking about research data, so I am a bit of a data geek. But given that, what I will endeavor to do for you today is to really offer you my opinion on why that's relevant to you and your particular organization. As David mentioned, what we're going to be offering today is really a set of insights and best practices that are grounded in peer-level market research. So we conducted a study the second half of 2019, nearly 400 respondents, all cybersecurity, DevOps, and IT pros, on a number of different domains related to securing cloud-native applications. And so the agenda that you see in front of you here today are really some of the key topics that we dove into in that particular research study. First off, we wanted to baseline, what is the technology stack that needs to be secured? What does it look like today? How's that going to change over time? So that's what the composition of cloud-native applications is all about. Then we wanted to understand the problem space. Hey, what are some of the challenges associated with securing cloud-native environments, so the stack, but also the environment in which cloud-native applications are being deployed. And then really get into this notion of secure DevOps. We're going to offer a definition of secure DevOps, take a look at some research data with respect to the rate of adoption. And then most importantly, we're going to get into some best practices. There are really sort of three fundamental cornerstones that we're going to offer up today on how we would suggest that you implement a secure DevOps program. And then I'll hand back over to David, who'll offer an overview of Trend Micro's Cloud One offering. Hopefully we'll have a little time for a little Q&A if I don't talk too long. And then we have some call to action with respect to resources where you can learn more. Okay, so let's jump in. Again, we'll start by taking a look at what the research data told us about the composition of cloud-native applications. And I thought a definition was in order with respect to what does cloud native mean. Now, there are cloud native businesses, right? So companies that are probably maybe 10 years or younger that have never seen the inside of a data center, right? Everything's sort of been cloud native with respect to their IT infrastructure and services have always been all about the cloud. but the other organizations that are sort of retooling their applications and their infrastructure to be cloud native. So for the purposes of this webinar, the way we're defining cloud native are applications that are built on an elastic microservices-based architecture, and they're managed via an agile DevOps processes. So one part technology, elastic and microservices-based, but also, and really the theme for today's webinar, is a big part on process and methodology. And we'll really get into sort of the intersection between agile and DevOps and how we bring security into the fold in terms of agile software development and DevOps integration and delivery. So one caveat though, cloud native does not necessarily mean that cloud native applications are deployed in and delivered from a public cloud. You know, we are very much operating, again, unless you're a cloud native organization, the rest of the world is really operating in a hybrid multi-cloud reality. And so cloud applications, cloud native applications, very well may be deployed from a private cloud, an on-prem private cloud. And this is the research data that really highlights that, that dynamic in the market. So in this question, we asked, hey, for your container-based applications, where will they be deployed in and delivered from? And as you can see, reading left to right, we have an appreciable percentage of organizations, nearly half of the respondents said, hey, you know what, moving forward, our container-based applications will be deployed in and delivered from a combination of public cloud platforms and private data centers. So what do I think is going on here? You know, one of the value propositions, one of the things that's really attractive about containers is portability. So as I am creating more discrete code components that are getting containerized, that are less dependent on the underlying infrastructure, and I've got sort of that optionality for figuring out the best fit on where those containers ought to be it on-prem or in one hyperscale CSP or another hyperscale CSP, I can move those around. At least that's the current thinking. Now, I also suspect that a lot of organizations aren't really yet sure where their containers are going to be deployed, but they want that optionality and flexibility moving forward. We're actually going to come back to this particular point in terms of where containerized apps will be deployed and delivered from when we think about container security challenges and requirements. Okay, so where are we at with container adoption? No question, containers have moved appreciably from dev and test environments into production. You know, we've got a little over 3/4 of the respondents in this study that said, yep, we have moved our containers from dev and test into production environments. We have another almost 1/4 of the respondents that are looking to move their containerized apps into production over the next 12 months. This is a sharp increase, by the way, from a related study we did just a couple of years ago where we had much smaller percentages of organizations that were running their containers in a production environment. So why is that, right? The question is, okay, so hey, broad adoption containers, it's sort of a modern VM, if you will. We talked about portability. Well, what's the driver here? So in another related study we conducted, we found that nearly 40% of organizations that are running containers in production report that they are significantly ahead of application development schedules. It's not a little ahead or kind of ahead, but significantly ahead. So it's really all about agility. It's sort of like, you know, I am, as an app dev team, a DevOps team, I am charged with getting new apps in production as quickly as possible and then iterating so I can be responsive to the market. And lo and behold, we're finding that is, in fact, a key business driver in why containers are moving into production environments. So we wanted to pose a couple of survey questions to all of you today. So we're curious as to what your organization adoption level is for the following technologies. We're going to talk about serverless in just a second. So if you could please select the options that are applicable here. If you're currently using containers, planning to use containers, currently using serverless, or planning to use serverless. And I'll give you just a minute to go ahead and answer those questions. And, you know, I mentioned we did a similar study a couple of years ago. We actually didn't ask about serverless in that study. It was just too early in the market. It's a bit of a nebulous turn to be on a serverless. But serverless is certainly coming on strong, as we'll see in just a moment. And so we absolutely wanted to ask about serverless this time around. Okay, David, I think I hit submit here, right?
Yep.
The responses.
See what those say.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for answering that first survey question in today's webinar. And yeah, I mean, the data is fairly consistent with our research data. We've got half of the folks on the webinar today that are already using containers, another, over a third that are planning to use containers. So that's certainly a vast majority that are containerizing applications today. And serverless certainly seems to be top of mind. So a number of you are thinking about serverless moving forward. Now, with respect to our research data, I just want to share the profile of the respondents in our study. As you'll see over the course of today's webinar, we asked a number of questions about cloud-native apps and security concerns. So we needed to make sure the respondents were literate on these topics. So we had qualifying questions that organizations that were participating were already using containers, already had workloads in public clouds. And so when you look at this slide and you see that, yep, serverless functions are already being quickly adopted, so we've got over a third that are already extensively using serverless, that's because there's a strong correlation between the use of serverless functions and those organizations that are already well down the path of using application containers. So tight correlation between containers and serverless. And when I think about cloud-native apps and microservices in general, it's a heterogeneous mix, right? We're definitely seeing serverless and containers. Right. So what about looking forward? We've got another 28% that are evaluating serverless. A couple of thoughts here. The app dev team is very often also playing an architect role. They're really have a lot of, they're really empowered, that's really what I'm saying, to make those sort of architectural decisions on the composition of a new application. And serverless allows them to meet their charter of being able to get production applications up and running really quickly. So that's just, I think, an adoption dynamic. From a security lens, one of the things I would encourage everybody on the call today is to revisit your threat model. Really think through, okay, how does an increasing use of serverless functions where I don't have control of the server that is executing that function impact my serverless model? What are the API vulnerabilities that I need to be aware of pre-deployment, but certainly also in runtime? Where are these applications being deployed? Certainly the broad adoption of containers muddies the water a little bit in terms of containers being deployed across the disparate environments that comprise a multi-hybrid cloud environment. But directionally, what we're seeing is a notable shift of server application workloads to public cloud platforms. So you can see in this particular survey question, we asked, we basically baseline today, hey, what percentage of your server workloads are running on a public cloud today? Then directionally, what's going to look like moving forward with respect, in the next 24 months? You can see that I highlighted those organizations that have indicated, the majority of server workloads. And so, with respect to the organizations that have more than half of the server workloads running a public platform today, that triples, right? It goes from 10% today to 30% here over the next 24 months. And we're going to get into just a little bit some of the challenges that creates in terms of this sort of, well talked about cloud security visibility gap with respect to workloads going to public cloud platforms.
Yeah, and Doug, there's a lot of technologies here that we're seeing today as well in our conversations with customers and prospects. We're looking here at this particular slide around serverless containers, VMs, and so on and so forth. And the adoption rate is very strong, but how is security reined in? What can security teams expect when having to deal with this hybrid type of environment?
Yeah, David, it's a great question. Because I'm always mindful of the fact that, and again, the qualifier is unless you're a cloud-native organization, that old technology doesn't get shut off overnight. And that's why, the research data tells us that there's a heterogeneous mix today with respect to the types of servers that are running in production. And moving forward in 24 months, again, directionally, it's going to maintain to be a heterogeneous mix moving forward. What does that mean to answer your question from a security perspective? It means you want security consistency. You want consistency of how you discover your assets, how you baseline the configuration of assets, how you deal with vulnerability management, how you have the appropriate runtime controls and policies across the disparate mix of several workload types, and really transition away from, using different series of point tools for different server types, which maybe is a necessity in the early days, but it becomes operationally inefficient and really untenable long term. So you really want to converge your approach and really have a full stack approach. I think that's sort of the best way to put it is, even though there's a lot of attention buzz right now around serverless, similarly to how there was around containers, it is a heterogeneous mix, and cloud native apps will be up and down this stack. And you really want to have a full stack approach to how you're securing your cloud native apps. Okay. So is it dark and stormy, in fact, on the horizon here with respect to the challenges for securing cloud-native environments? We'll look at some of the problems. We did not come to today's webinar with a sort of, glass half empty, sky is falling sort of orientation. This really is about best practices and solutions, but we did want to share with you, just to set up some of those best practices, some of the challenges that the respondents in our study shared with us in terms of securing their cloud-native apps in the environments. So the first one actually, that dovetails really well off the prior slide, which is it's really all about consistency. The number one challenge that the nearly 400 organizations who participated in the study said, I've got a hybrid multi-cloud environment where my cloud-native applications are being deployed, and consistency is really hard across those environments. And sort of one of the themes in a lot of our research studies is this notion of going from siloed to unified, which is to say it's pretty typical when a new technology hits that the default response for most companies, and it's legitimate, is I use separate controls for separate environments managed by separate teams. And as that new environment, that new technology sort of gains critical mass, it really becomes business critical, becomes more front and center as a meaningful part of your overall IT infrastructure. It needs to get mainlined. It needs to get brought back into the fold. And that's really all about having a unified, consistent policy across your environment. And that's really what I'm talking about in the second point, where we have 35% of the respondents says that, use of multiple cybersecurity controls increases cost and complexity. That businesses may accept cost and complexity for an interim period, but again, directionally, they want to get to a unified posture. And then finally, the third one, I could go on the slide forever, but just the third one is really what I was mentioning earlier about revisiting your threat model. So like, okay, I've got containers and they're portable, and by the way, they're ephemeral, so they sort of come and go. And serverless functions, so I got my FDev team that are using serverless, and I don't have access to the server, so where do I insert a security control? This is all about, this notion of sort of lack of understanding of the threat types, attack vectors, and methods specific to cloud-native applications is about revisiting your threat model and understanding that stack and where the vulnerabilities are in the stack. What about containers? So we actually also asked this question in the study we did a couple of years ago, but we didn't have this first response option in the study we had a couple of years ago, and I'm glad we added this in because the hypothesis was that because application containers are portable, that organizations are concerned about aligning the technical implementation, the architectural implementation of a container security control with how they're going to deploy their containers. So, for example, if you are standing up and managing your own kube cluster, you've got access to the host as well as the guest, and you can implement a host level control. You can use sidecars. You can even inject code at build time into the container. But if you're consuming container as a service or kube as a service, in other words, you're using something like Fargate, you don't have access to the host. And so a container security control that only provides host level implementation isn't going to work. It's just not architecturally designed for your environment. So that was the number one challenge. The solution, of course, is to look for container security controls that give you optionality, that give you flexibility. So just like you want flexibility deployment, you also want flexibility that your container security controls will support different models. It's kind of like the cloud access security broker market, the CASB market, quick tangent. There are different implementations there in terms of API and proxy and agents, and really you want multi-mode in that sort of context. Same thing here, you want to have flexibility in deployment options. Now, there are other challenges, and these challenges sort of map to the life cycle of an application container, with the second top challenge being the need to verify images that are stored in a container registry to make sure that they're compliant, that they're trusted, that they don't have any known vulnerabilities or at least severe vulnerabilities, both software vulns and configuration vulns. There's certainly other challenges. We've got challenges here sort of related to tools. Hey, I'm currently using a workload security product that doesn't support containers. We're a little worried about container sprawl, so sort of a sort of variation of shadow IT. A lot of what I'm seeing in this research data reminds me of VM sprawl and all the security concerns we had when VMware hit and we had ESX instances, sort of popping up all over the place because it was so easy for people to spin up new VMs. Same sort of dynamic, but again, the big takeaway here in container security is aligning the architectural implementation of the security control with how you're going to deploy your containers. All right, attack types. Look, every time we do a research study and we ask about attack types organizations have experienced or certain attack types that are top of mind, no one on the call here is going to be surprised that there's a lot to worry about. So when I look at a slide like this and these research results, I'm looking for the themes. And I think there's sort of two themes here, right? Well, maybe three. Okay. First theme is the top of mind attack types run the gamut, like the title says. Okay, so that's sort of the obvious point, thing one. The other 2 points I would offer here is that the known vulns and sort of tried and true exploits are still worrisome in a cloud native environment. So be it SQL injections or other types of vulns lower in the stack are still top of mind. But what is different here are new vulnerabilities through the broad use of APIs and serverless. So again, the need to revisit the threat model and the emphasis on configurations. Since we've got workloads that are running outside of our network perimeter, really being able to understand the configuration of our entire cloud footprint through a cloud security posture management type of product is increasingly important, because you can't rely on catching it on the wire through an IDS/IPS or a firewall. We really need to make sure we've got strong, sort of posture of the workload as it goes through its life cycle from build time into production. So that's what I would say in terms of sort of themes here. Hey, there's a lot to worry about. There's old vulns we're worried about. There's also some new vulns, especially with respect to APIs and configs. Okay. Sometimes when I present this slide, I've got a picture of a guy in a snowstorm, and he can't really see so well, and that's just to really, sort of graphically depict that we've got this cloud security visibility gap. It's a pretty common refrain in cloud security, and it's directly correlated to the point I made in the prior slide, which is, this notion of an amorphous perimeter. The physical perimeter in a hybrid multi-cloud world does not go away. We'll still need the controls in the DMZ, but as we saw before, as more workloads go to a public cloud platform, the workload becomes a perimeter. And you need to gain visibility of exactly what's happening on that workload. And that's why the number one response from our participants in this research study, when we asked them, where do you need to gain greater visibility for the public cloud hosted cloud native applications? They said, I need to do a better job in identifying workload configs that are out of compliance, that don't adhere to best practices and regulatory frameworks. Think CIS benchmarks, right? That's an awfully good place to start. So whatever Linux distro it may be, or containers or the app stack, there's going to be a CIS benchmark. You want to be measuring your configs against those benchmark pre-deployment before you push into prod to make sure you don't have any config vulns. There are other areas of lack of visibility. Certainly, the use of a privileged user account. So this is obviously using things like CloudTrail. So you've got an audit trail of that type of activity. All right. Hey, so enough of problems. Let's get into some of the solutions. So far we've taken a look at the composition of cloud-native applications. We've taken a look at some of the challenges that our respondents have shared with us in securing those applications. And now we're going to dive into this notion of secure DevOps. What's the definition, adoption, and some best practices?
So, Doug, what do cloud and DevOps security teams need to think about when they're retooling for cloud projects? There's a lot on the line, a lot of new technologies as you've gone through. But what are some of the fundamental ideas that they need to consider on the table?
Yeah, boy, David, I could do an hour webinar on that question in itself. It's a great one. I'll try to make one core point here. The move to the cloud and the architecture, implementation, deployment of cloud-native apps is as much about soft skills and approach with respect to understanding modern processes and methodologies as it is about the technology. IT, big picture, right? IT increasingly is becoming decentralized. We have app dev and DevOps teams that are in the line of business that are off and running. They are not at all in any way, shape, or form following the traditional waterfall approach or working with the centralized IT team on defining requirements, going through, RFIs, going through, hardware procurement, doing the rack and stack, doing the optimization, and waiting a couple of quarters, if not more, before the application is into production. They are off and running by using things like agile software development, where they're writing user stories, they're doing daily stand-ups, they're pushing to production maybe initially every couple of weeks, maybe eventually multiple times a day. And the dovetail is with DevOps. So they're using agile software development as their sort of project management and product management methodology led by the product owner. And they're using the continuous integration and continuous delivery processes of a DevOps approach to have a cross-functional and collaborative approach between the dev team and the ops team to similarly iterate. So just like they're iterating with Agile on getting feedback from the market on features and functions on the software, they're also continually iterating and optimizing on their integration and delivery. Totally different world for security professionals. And, unfortunately, the reality is the security team often isn't included, right? We know security often isn't invited to a stand-up, just not invited to participate in the Scrum team out of fear that security is going to try to throw up roadblocks, talk about risk, slow things down. And so the first word of advice I would have for security professionals is, this is the new normal. We need to understand these processes. We need to understand how we integrate into this world. And that's what I mean by the soft skills. It's really a cultural shift and cultural approach. So we need to sort of understand how we brought dev and ops together, so then we can bring security into the fold. Because if we get into the best practices, I really do sincerely believe that we can include security processes and technologies without slowing down DevOps. But we just have to understand the mindset of the dev team and the ops team before we try to make the case to do so.
A good point.
Hey, I should have mentioned on that prior slide. The prior slide talked about, showed the research results for the degree to which organizations are deploying agile software development or deploying DevOps. Strong correlation between the two. No surprise, makes a ton of sense. 3/4 of those organizations that are extensively employing one or the other are doing the other. So if I'm extensively employing agile, it is highly likely 3/4 of the time that I'm also going to be extensively deploying DevOps. Strong correlation. Natural next question, as we're showing on this slide, is, well, what about security? Is security included in our DevOps processes? Increasingly, it is. So again, for those organizations that participated in this study, they're sort of down the path on their cloud-native journey, as I mentioned, right? So they're already containerizing applications and using public cloud. Of those types of organizations, over a third, 36%, have already incorporated security into their DevOps processes extensively. Love to hear that. That's awesome. So Devsecops is definitely emerging, but we have another nearly 20% that are doing it limited. They're sort of toe tipping, I should say, or they're planning. So we know there are almost 25% that are planning to incorporate security into DevOps processes. It's 22%, and another 20 that are evaluating use cases. So great that over a third are well down the path. Wish the 19% that are doing it limited were doing it more extensively. And then we got a bunch of other companies that are thinking about it, planning it, going to do it soon. What do I think that means? I think we need more specificity of use cases, and we need to be thinking about repeatability. background here is overstated in the office. We have an acute shortage of cybersecurity skills. Now we're asking our cybersecurity team to embed themselves into Scrum teams. Very often they need to start coding. And one of the ways to scale secure DevOps practices is to think about security as code. So just like we think about infrastructure as code, we need to think about security as code. So as we're writing code snippets that are providing those security checks along the application lifecycle, along the CI/CD toolchain, they're reusable components. That's how we get scale over time. Okay. Great. Well, thanks for waiting for a half hour to get to the first best practice. We just wanted to set up again what these environments look like, challenges, overall adoption of DevOps and secure DevOps. So what's the first best practice? I sort of touched upon this, and I think it has to start here. Like every secure DevOps initiative and program has to start with organizational dynamics. It fundamentally has to include treating cloud security as a shared responsibility. It shouldn't be just on the DevOps team. It shouldn't just be on the security team. It's got to be shared across the cross-functional project team. How are we doing on that front? So one of the questions we asked in this study was, when does a member of your organization's cybersecurity team typically get involved? When do you bring them into the fold? So kudos to the third of the organizations who says, you know what, we do it right from the beginning. Love to hear that. What that says to me is when a new project kicks off and user stories are getting defined in Jira or whatever your project management tool is, that their security user stories are out of the gate. Awesome. Some wait until they push to prod. Okay, now you're already in production. You haven't really thought about security yet. Well, maybe, you know what, to be fair, maybe they have thought about security, right? This is when a security team member gets involved. So they probably thought about some security, but they don't necessarily have the domain expertise, right, around security. So, and, from my mind, they've waited a little late. Those that have, waited until they've got sensitive data colliding to VEP have waited definitely too late. I'm not even sure I should comment on those that have said, after I've had an incident or I'm tin cupping for money. So come on, guys, like that's, that's reactive. That's sort of, back of the heels. So I guess what I wanted to ask everybody today is when you think about your organization and as you move from, I guess I would say sort of traditional IT and traditional cybersecurity, and you move into this new world of agile software development and DevOps and cloud native and iterating and going fast, are you treating cybersecurity as a shared responsibility? What's that look like in your organization? So I'll give you a minute to think about that and answer it. And by the way, change takes time. I think obviously being a change agent, organizational dynamics don't happen overnight. And at the end of the day, it starts with understanding each other's objectives. Obviously, an active DevOps team at the end of the day is chartered with speed, right? Chartered with getting new apps into production to capitalize on business opportunities. Security is all about risk management, right? It's all about mitigating risk. Traditionally, that has meant going slower. That has meant being really deliberate for obviously good reasons. And part of the way to bridge the gap here is to understand each other's world. All right, let's look at the survey results. Awesome, love that. Almost 2/3 say that, yeah, you know what, our organization does treat cloud security as a shared responsibility, with a little over another third of the folks on the webinar today who have indicated, yeah, it's not a shared responsibility. So feeling in those organizations is that, typically falls to the cyber team. So this is consistent with the research. I really feel like we're making progress here. And with, again, this best practice, this is really where it starts. It's hard to implement secure DevOps programs and user stories without there being alignment. At the end of the day, this is all about organizational alignment, that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. So a reasonable question was, well, did you ask who's responsible for cybersecurity in your survey? You bet we did. We actually had time series data here, right? So we asked who was responsible for securing and cloud native applications 12 months ago? Who's responsible today? Who's going to be responsible moving forward? We thought just for clarity of representing research data, we would show just who's responsible today. But the reason I mentioned that we had those 3 different time frames is I wanted to share with you, at least verbally, that security has gotten a lot more involved over the last 12 to 24 months. Good news. Again, I mentioned the word directionally a couple of times, and when I look at research data that has that sort of time series data, I am looking for directional trends. So I'm certainly encouraged that that security team is getting more involved over time. But the other reality, if you look at these horizontal bar charts, is there are a lot of people involved, right? There isn't one group who is sort of solely responsible, or even mostly responsible for securing cloud native applications. IT ops involved, security is involved, the line of business application owner absolutely involved. Obviously, the DevOps delivery team's involved, cloud engineering. So a lot of folks are involved. It's very much a cross-functional endeavor, as it should be. That's what DevOps is all about. And when we think about secure DevOps, that certainly should be the case as well. And that gets better over time. So another question we asked was, what percentage of your cloud native apps will be secured with the involvement of a member of your cyber team? And, again, this is a glass half full, glass empty sort of slide. I mean, on the one hand, I can say, geez, only 12% of organizations said that more than 3/4 of their projects are being being secured with the involvement of a member of the cyber team. But that increases dramatically over the next 24 months. Love to see that. So 41% say that, yep, moving forward, next 24 months, more than almost all of our apps, more than 75% of our projects are to include a member of the cyber team. So absolutely heading in the right direction. Okay. So best practice number 2 is implement secure DevOps use cases along the lifecycle continuum. A number of ways we could have drawn this graphic. Sort of a repeating recycling circle probably would have been a more appropriate graphic, to be honest with you, because everybody in the call, I'm sure, has seen this CI/CD horizontal figure 8 loop. So that's the way we should be thinking about this, is that there is a continuum of the app lifecycle from dev time to build time to run time, right back to dev time and so forth. And so this is a destination. Like I think one of the things in thinking about secure DevOps, almost any project, it can be daunting. And the important thing is to get started, get a win under your belt, make it repeatable, and then expand over time. So I would encourage anybody on the call today who hasn't implemented Devsecops or secure DevOps to try to cover all the ground right out of the gate. Be prescriptive. Start with a use case or 2. Get a win. Get confidence with your DevOps team that you're not going to slow things down, and then expand from there, not only across the lifecycle but across additional projects. And that's one of the things I wanted to understand in this research study is where are organizations starting? What type of use cases have they implemented? So we asked specifically, now in the study, by the way, we didn't categorize them by pre-deployment and runtime. We just asked which of the following secure DevOps use cases are you currently implementing? By the way, we did ask them this question initially, like 12 months ago or whatever. One of you started doing Devsecops. What was your first use case? What are today's use cases? What are your future use cases? For simplicity, we're just showing current use cases, but I can share with you that use cases have expanded over time, and I think that's pragmatic. I think it's just like that's the right approach. So top pre-deployment use cases. Identify and remediate workload and container configs and software vulns before deployment to production. Completely consistent with the number 1 problem statement around visibility. So a couple slides back, I said, hey, what's the number one area in which you need to improve your visibility into your public cloud resident workloads, configs? What's the number 1 per deployment use case? Dealing with vulns, be it software vulns or config vulns. So it's automated hardening, basically, of your server workloads before you push into prod. And that's highly repeatable. Sort of like once you codify that, you can repeat that across other projects for scale. Certainly, we don't want to push it in production with malware. We want to have inspection and security posture of the API, so that's also pragmatic for me because you want to understand how increased use of APIs changes your threat model, which includes discovering and doing an inventory of the APIs that you're using in your source code. Okay, great. So we've pushed to prod. What do we do in the runtime? So one of the interesting dynamics of these ephemeral environments is if you're unfortunately in a situation where you're doing an investigation, right? So you're doing some IR work, you believe you've been compromised, or you in fact have been breached. So those systems are very often no longer available. They had a short lifetime. They're gone. You can't go in and look at an onboard system log. And so that's why the number one response is I want to automate capturing system activity for IR forensics and threat hunting. Second one is doing access controls. So, either instrumenting host-based firewalls or other microsite controls to be able to control what containers or workloads can talk to each other, obviously implying, automating the application of preventative runtime controls. So integrating with your automation and orchestration tools like a Chef or Puppet or Ansible or CloudFormation, so as you're pushing to prod, you're automatically deploying cloud workload protection controls that do anti-malware, anti-exploit runtime controls protection. And then also, controls that are looking for anomalous activity. So anomalous user activity, process activity, NetFlow, et cetera. I guess the main point I want to make in the slide is, again, don't boil the ocean out of the gate. Start with any of these use cases that feel right to you as a starting point. With that said, I do think our respondents are sort of clearly saying, I got a visibility gap, so I'm going to solve that visibility gap first by focusing on identifying and remediating configuration and software vulns pre-deployment before I push to prod. Makes a ton of sense to me. You're hardening configs, you're reducing attack surface. But if you feel like you need to start in runtime, fine. You can always go back and implement pre-deployment, but your destination should be the life cycle, right? Ultimately, where you want to get to is to implement these use cases across the entire life cycle. What are the controls that allow you to do that? So we talked about the use cases. The controls map directly to that. So just talked a good bit about the need to identify and remediate software and config vulns. And so the number one type of control from a pre-deployment use case is those controls that allow you to do just that. In this case, it was specific to containers. So being able to identify vulnerabilities in registry resident containers. So as you're pulling that image out and you're doing your build, you can check it right there, make sure you have known vulns. And then API vulnerability management, I've got a annotation here in both. So this is there are controls and use cases that apply both pre-deployment and runtime. And runtime controls. So again, this maps absolutely directly to the use cases. You want to make sure that I've got effective anti-malware detection and prevention. So would suggest that similarly to your endpoint security controls that are using multiple techniques to detect and prevent malware, so static sort of controls in terms of signatures, but also machine learning, and then runtime behavior analysis. Same ought to be true for malware that can be moving laterally to your server workloads. Obviously, when it comes to vulns, we're not just worried about known vulns, we're also worried about 0 days. So we want to have some ability to detect vulns and anti-exploits, so things like virtual patching in a production environment. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the need to log system activity for IR and investigations. So, this is the DVR recorder analogy that a lot of folks talk about. So you want to be able to capture that system activity in case you need to go back, your SOC team needs to go back and do some analysis. There are a number of other controls you can see on the slide here, everything from, having an inventory of APIs and access controls and anti-exploit. So all good stuff. That is best practice number 2. What else can I say there? And yeah, I think, let me just try to connect some dots. Talk a little about agile software development, sort of the cultural dynamics, and then that last best practice is all about use cases. One of the things I would suggest you do is to work with the product owner on writing user stories. So take some of these use cases that resonate the most with you and try to get them into the next sprint. But the way they get implemented is you need to be providing the collective team with security controls that are purposeful for the environment. It's highly likely that your traditional security stack isn't going to play nicely in the sandbox with your CI/CD tool. So you're going to have controls that are designed that have the integration points with that CI/CD tool chaining. So they understand how to get into a registry. They can do a check upon a build with Jenkins. They can automatically push with Chef and Puppet. So we really have to sort of understand that tool chain, integrate natively, and that's going to reduce friction with the DevOps team. So that's another sort of color commentary on the last best practice. Okay, third one, I'll make sure we leave time for Q&A, so I'll go through this one fairly quickly. This is, earlier I was talking about the sort of shift from siloed to unified, and so we wanted to ask the respondents in the study if directionally they're planning to consolidate. And we said, which of the following is your organization's likeliest cloud security application control selection strategy moving forward? So moving forward directionally, where you're going. And we got half the respondents says, yeah, you know what, we intend to consolidate our controls from point tools to suites that ride on platforms, and we're going to procure from a smaller number of vendors. This totally maps to sort of the journey and the relative maturity. More than half the market is going to go here. This is indicative of those organizations that are further along their cloud native journey. They already get this. They already maybe used a series of point tools. It was, maybe it was a necessity to get going. But again, as that as a cloud native part of their environment gains critical mass, they want to have a unified approach. They need to do that through convergence. Why? Right? Why are we driving toward convergence? I mean, it's consistency and efficiency. We saw earlier, number one challenge is consistency. And sure enough, that's the top driver is, hey, to be able to solve for that problem of lack of consistency across my disparate environments, I need to converge. I'm not going to, it's hard to be consistent by using, a series of different point tools. It's got to have a single console, single policy, single visibility across these environments, up and down the stack. I can see serverless, I can see containers, I can see VMs, I can see bare metal. And by the way, the 21% really highlight how much more efficient that's going to be. So not only is there an acute shortage of cyber skills, there's an acute shortage of DevOps skills. I mean, this is new still. It's been around for 10 years. But those organizations that are on their journey, if you're enterprise that are moving in this direction or starting to do this, DevOps, experienced professionals are not easy to find, and so you want to bring as much efficiency into the tooling of your environment as you can. What are the products that allow you to do that? What we're seeing at the top of the list is the market is telling us, well, the most mature cloud security product categories are those in which we will make the most substantial investments moving forward. So cloud workload protection platforms and cloud security posture management. ESG's point of view on this, by the way, is that these product categories will converge. That's what the research tells us. So while we're showing two disparate product categories here today, we think this simply moves into a cloud native application stack that allows you to do assess the posture of your configs in your entire cloud footprint, so not just the cloud native stack, but also how you're using APIs, your identity and access management settings, and more, so sort of a holistic config view of your cloud footprint. And then using a cloud workload protection platform that deals with the whole life cycle from pre-deployment into runtime. So we think these two categories converge into one, and they subsume a lot of the other categories like container security and API security. So directionally, ESG's point of view is a lot of consolidation of disparate features and functions and controls really into a platform. In closing, just want to wrap up that, I think the charter here for the cross-functional team, I don't want to say just the security team, that's the team sport, is to keep pace at scale. There's no more putting the DevOps genie back in the bottle. Boy, that's a horrible metaphor. You know what I mean, though, right? It's like, we're not going backwards. We're not going to go back to sort of traditional processing methodology. This, like I said, has become the new normal. So the charter is, how do I keep pace at scale? What's encouraging, the research data says, is we're going to get there. While only 8% of the organizations tell us today that more than 3/4 of their applications are being secured through Devsecops or secure DevOps practices today, that jumps to 35% here over the next little while. So Yeah, when I do research data, I'm an optimist. I'm looking for, directional improvement where we can really move the needle, and I think we're seeing that. It's good stuff.
Thank you, Doug. So a couple of questions have come in. We've answered a couple of them in line as well. So what's your interpretation, Doug, of the future? Let's say 2-3 years down the road as technologies change so quite rapidly, as we see services be built up among the cloud providers themselves. How do you see security practitioners and dev teams preparing for this in the future?
Yeah, I think so big picture, it's an application economy. That means the dev team is empowered, like I said, and the infrastructure continues to become abstracted. VMs were an abstraction, containers were the further abstraction, APIs and serverless are yet a further abstraction. So I think infrastructure continues to get abstracted. Not that, again, old tech, like I said before, old tech gets turned off overnight. I think that's a transition over time. But I think increasingly, as it does become about infrastructure as code, it needs to become about security as code. And so we need to encourage our dev team to be thinking about security. And that also includes dev time controls, like AppSec controls. And our security team needs to also think about how they create reusable code components. So I think a lot of the trending data we see in the research here, David, is are giving indicators on where we're moving forward, where it's not just a technology shift, it's a process and methodology, and really an organizational shift.
Perfect. Okay. Let me just move forward then with the next slide as we wrap up. So at Trend Micro, we're really seeing 3 key priorities for organizations that are building in the cloud. The first one is cloud migration. This is a big transition for a lot of companies. It's not a complete rollover into a new set of technologies or parameters, but hybrid cloud and multi-cloud, this is really the norm. We're seeing a number of different instances where hybrid cloud is the way that companies are going. They don't just dive into one specific technology such as serverless and transition their applications overnight. They're using monolithic approaches, but they have new platforms that they have to adapt to, and this is where the DevOps transition comes into play really quickly for them. Secondly is the cloud native application delivery itself. So this is all about delivering fast, iterative, often several times a day in some cases or more, applications that are built on infrastructure as code. Open source and public code repositories are very key here as well. And then third and finally, organizations are forming teams with a single goal of achieving a cloud center of operational excellence. And this is really all about driving that cloud native application set further and further into the business platform so that they can benefit from these new technologies as quickly as possible. But they have to oversee this as well. And so that cloud center of excellence is really key to this. So how do you secure such a complex and fast-paced environment? And this is really where Trend Micro steps in. We have the ability to provide the right tool sets, and we do this through what we call Trend Micro Cloud One. This is a new cloud-native SaaS platform, that incorporates, or is essentially the world's most comprehensive security services for cloud builders. This is all about a single sign-on, common user and cloud enrollment, one place for visibility, common procurement and billing, expanding the platform as best that you need it in order to gain the technology and the services to have the most security in hand for your platform. So this is all about being able to provide IT security and cloud architects and those Devsecops teams with the flexibility to give those builders some choice. And this also helps to meet corporate and security and governance needs as well across the board. So a couple of places you can go to learn more about this, trendmicro.com/hybridcloud. We'll have a lot of information on there, as well as trendmicro.com DevOps. So you'll be able to go there and learn more about the Cloud One platform itself. So Doug, why don't you wrap up just with the survey results in the webinar today?
Sure, David, happy to. And again, thanks everybody for joining. We covered a lot of ground, and hopefully what David and I have been able to impart today is how peer-level market research from 400 organizations is relevant for you, not only in terms of the composition of cloud-native apps and the challenges, but really most importantly how they're solving for securing these modern application stacks through modern processes. And I guess one other comment is it doesn't matter so much if we call this secure DevOps or DevSecOps. There's some discussion in the market that security ought to be just involved and already included in DevOps, so we shouldn't have a new term for it. Fair enough. So it's not really about the term or what we call it. It's really about the organizational dynamics and gaining alignment that security ought to be a shared responsibility, and that implementing that shared responsibility is doing so across the entire application lifecycle with a converged approach. I think that's sort of the connect the dots between the three best practices. And if I were a cloud security architect, for example, and leading the charge on securing my organization's cloud footprint and cloud native applications, I think that's the way I would put it. I would really focus around organizational alignment. So we can think about how we integrate the continuous integration and delivery lifecycle cloud native applications, and doing so operational efficiently with a solution that allows me to go up and down the stack, and that's really built for being extensible over time. David, what do you think? Is that, we think about sort of how Trend consults your customers, is that an approach that you guys are prescribing?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we have, the ability to go in and have great conversations across the board, not only with the IT security teams, but also those DevOps teams, so we can transition that across and bridge that divide. And we're seeing that nuance become a lot easier for organizations today as the technologies weigh in and become a lot simpler for those groups to use. So that's exactly the type of approach that we're seeing. Okay, well, thank you very much, Doug, for everything, and everybody. We'll be sending out some more information to you along with a recording of this webinar. We appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you soon on our next webinar series at Trend Micro. Thank you.